So when we talk about spiritual truths, what are we really talking about? And to try and unpick that, we have to unpick what spiritual means. And you may think, oh, well, I know what spiritual means. You may have your own concept of it. But I can assure you that there are many, many definitions coming out about spiritual and spirituality. Perhaps I better say what I feel that it means, and I feel that it means the core, the essence, the heart of who we are. But there again, there's another question in that: who are we? What are we? One of the most common questions I get asked as a teacher is, what is our purpose? What is my purpose? I often get people come for sittings who specifically come to ask what their purpose is. And I always have a bit of problem with that question, because I'm not sure that we have a purpose in that ego sense. In fact, the very question might be ego-bound. Certainly, what I am clear in my mind is that there is a life force that runs through everything, all living things. And in some way, that life force allows us to be interconnected, but we don't always realise it. So that's my perception of spiritual, but it might not be yours. Set religions in the last 50 years have fallen away, largely. We've got this spiritual movement, this New Age movement that we're in. And the title New Age is very misleading, because actually what we're dealing with is not new at all. It's actually ancient. It's what all mystics through all creeds and cultures have known and understood. So when I've been doing my research, on one hand I've been jolly pleased to discover that all these people down the ages are doing what I'm doing and what we're doing, but then I feel terribly sad, because I think, well, if they've been doing it for ages, thousands of years, why are we still having to talk about it? Why are we still living it? What's happening here? So there's questions there. There are certain things about the myriad of New Age activities that I personally question. And you may say they're truth, you may say they're illusion, and vice versa. But let's just have a look at one or two of them. Let's look at the dogma of the New Age. And I do use that word quite deliberately, because there is a feeling with some that because they're in a New Age movement, they've abandoned the dogma. But actually, in reality, what a lot of people have done is have just swapped the dogma. So they've swapped one dogma for another. They haven't really emancipated. So let's look at some of these ideas. The idea of initiation. You see it in magazines all the time, don't you? Come and be initiated. Come and be a master in 2 days or something. If you go to this person or this group, this is special, this will initiate you, this will make you achieve greater spirituality, so on and so forth, whatever claims they have. And it's kind of like joining a club. So if you join this club, you're special, you're unique. But if we're all spiritual and we've all got this life force running through us, we're all special, we're all unique, we're all our own masters. So there's a question there. One of my favourites that I personally fell foul of myself some years ago is this idea that if you're spiritual, you have to be nice to everybody. I spent 6 years being very nice to people, particularly in the organisation I then worked for. And I was terribly upset and perplexed why all I seemed to get was really a very hard deal from everybody. And I was just trying to be nice and spiritual and pleasant and so forth. And then it suddenly clicked with me. By being nice, I actually wasn't always being truthful to myself. And it was quite a revelation that. And almost in a moment, I thought I realised what I was doing wrong, and I started being truthful. And then I really got it in the back of the neck from everybody, because they didn't know what was going on. But, there's this idea that you must only say a nice thing. And that's a lovely concept. It's a sort of Libran, sort of 60s, child of the 60s, of which I'm one, of course, would do, all love and light and peace and harmony and so forth. But if you unpick that, and you're not actually revealing what you feel, what you think, what you are, you're not revealing your core self, you're not revealing your spirituality, you're not being spiritual. But I've actually seen a lot of people in organisations, and there's one in particular which I won't name, but it's a very well-known healing organisation, and the general manager at the time said to me, he said, the trouble is, Julie, everybody's walking around trying to be nice to everybody. I just wish they'd say what they thought. And then you get into pettiness, because what's happened is there's a real communication breakdown. We're energetic creatures. So if we're saying one thing and feeling something else, the person is hearing what you're saying, but they're sensing something else. And there's a mismatch. There's a communication breakdown going on. And people become very uneasy and unsure. They're not sure why they're uneasy, and they're not sure why they don't trust you. And the person themselves that's trying to be nice is doing it probably out of very good intentions. But then the road to hell is often paved with good intentions, isn't it? So that's another thing about the New Age dogma. Then, of course, there's, to some extent, what I'm about to say is, I feel, dying away somewhat, and I personally would say thank goodness. But the whole guru thing, which I feel is not part of the emancipation of people, but this idea that if you go and see this person, that you somehow will get something over and above someone else. And I'd just like to relay a very short story here about a lady who came to me 2 weeks ago for a sitting. She was a very, very spiritual lady. There's no question about her intention. There's no question about her dedication to spirit and the spiritual world. In fact, she dedicated her whole life to it. But she earlier on had followed another very well-known spiritual teacher, and she spent quite a bit of time in a sort of ashram type environment with this master guru, totally dedicating her life. And along came a chap who was a bit down on his luck, and the guru took heart and gave him quite a bit of money. So she thought that this man must be something special, and she actually ended up marrying him. And the long and short of it is, he completely swindled her out of her money, her property, and did a runner. That was hard for her, obviously, given that this man was advocated by this very important guru. But then she had another very similar experience, very similar, without going into details, and exactly the same thing happened. She's a very generous lady, and she'd given up thousands of pounds to this second husband who did exactly the same. Now, she was quite happy to give her money freely, but she didn't expect to be driven roughshod over herself. And she realised that something was wrong. Now, it's not for me to judge or make judgment, but what I did feel was that in some way she was being asked to look to herself to judge and to draw on her own spiritual notions and ideal and not lean on other people. And I think that's possibly the danger of the gurus. Now, the famous ones, they're easy to see, but actually the guru syndrome is going on all over the place. I worked in an organisation some years ago, and a healer came in as a teacher, and he really attracted this sort of following. And he had all these women following him around and, virtually laying their lives down for him. And so it's very difficult. It's very difficult if you are in a teaching position sometimes not to have that. But again, does that make you more spiritual if you're following a particular person? Leave it to you to establish. Then we have the dogma of if you're a vegetarian, you're more spiritual. If you don't drink alcohol, you're more spiritual. If you don't smoke, you're more spiritual. And now we can't drink coffee or tea because that's wrong too. Well, of course, that's your own choice, and you may want to do it for health reasons or whatever. But given that all these things are part of the natural world, there is a question mark on them as well. Are you really more spiritual if you give up a bit of coffee and you stop smoking? I don't know. But again, that's for you to ask yourself. It's the dogma of it that I think is the danger. It's the notion that if you do a certain thing like this, that you are automatically a better spiritual person. And then we have things like spirit guides. Well, we could go on forever about that. Just because you have a guide who may be a cosmic out in the cosmos and maybe he's got a spaceship, does it make them more spiritual? That's a question. It may be fantastic if you have, but does that make you more spiritual? Does your guide that comes from some far-flung place in the universe have more information that you need as a living human being here on planet Earth? I don't know. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I love a quote that I heard many years ago, also about, this was someone of the spiritualist movement, and the quote was, just because you're in the spirit world doesn't give you a greater IQ. So the idea that if you're linking with something that is in spirit, whether it is a dear departed in spirit or whether it is some cosmic guide or angel or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that they've got more information than you. And I think this is very much about discernment. Then there's things like holistic medicines. It's like this attitude that only something that is herbal is better for you than orthodox medicine. Well, given the fact that they're all chemicals, whether they're man-made or... Well, in fact, there's no such thing as man-made, really. When you think about it, it's all of the earth. This building is from the earth. You go into a city and you see these skyscrapers, they're still of the earth. There's nothing that isn't of the earth. So, this sort of tut-tut, are you taking some medicine from your doctor? The idea that, you failed in some way if you've gone to an orthodox doctor. And you may need an orthodox doctor. If you suddenly have a flare-up of an appendix and your appendix need to come out, you've got to go into the hospital and have them out. So, it's about perspective and sense of balance, isn't it? They go overboard on it. I've had students that go into apoplexy when they have a common cold because they think, there must be some awful metaphysical reason why I've got a cold and I must have done something terribly wrong. And, there's this sort of judgment that goes on it. What do we do about this? Because when you think about it, in a way, we're all searching for truth, all of us. We're all seekers of truth. And how do we find truth? Where is truth? Is it in some model or religion or creed? Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. I would suggest that you are prepared to be very discerning and intuit what is right for you. I used to get quite judgmental on certain practices, particularly healing practices I'm not particularly fond of. But I've mellowed a bit in my older age, and I now feel that there's probably no such thing as a bad practice, but I still think there could be such a thing as a bad practitioner. I think if your intention is pure, that sounds a bit, I don't know what the word is, it sounds a bit religious or something to say if your intention is pure, but if your intention is genuine, and I'm not talking about ideas of what one must do, but if you personally have pure motive, let's use the word pure motive, I don't think it matters what practice you use as a healer or whatever it is, because you will be an open channel to spiritual light. But I think if your intention is not pure, as it were, if you don't have good motive, pure motive, then I think you do get into trouble, and that's a problem. So what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, and I'm sure Harry and this centre know very well, particularly in the healing movement, is a move towards creating good practitioners. I took the attitude that healing is not something you could measure, and I still hold that to be true, but I think if you have good training and you do develop a good practitioner, then it does help the process. And it wheedles out people that are in it just for a quick 5 minutes study, and they feel that they can work in the field. It is fraught with difficulties, all this. I mentioned earlier that I have a real sense, and I expect some of you, if not all of you, do the same, that we're all part of a living energy. Call it chi, call it God, call it life force, call it what you will. How do we talk to that? How do we understand that? How do we know it within ourselves? It does, I believe, necessitate what I call an unfoldment process. Because the reality, as I understand it, is that we all have this innate intuition, we all have this innate spirituality, but the noise of modern life very often blocks it out in so many ways. Patterns born from childhood, society, parents, friends, so forth, have stopped us very often looking at who we are, from listening. And of course, this is where exercises like meditation are so valuable to us, to stop and listen to ourselves. But in the early stages particularly, how can we be sure that the voice we're hearing is the true inner voice and not something else, not wishful thinking, not illusion? If you're dedicated to be on the spiritual path, you almost certainly have gone down some blind alleys. I know I have. And I think having the courage to say, well, hang on a minute, I think I got that wrong, I think is really important. And I don't think we should be afraid to do that. In the widest scheme of things, of course, what is right and wrong? You could argue there is no such thing as right or wrong, because everything has given us an experience. I was giving a talk to a group of people, and we were talking about this, and it came up about experience and how we validate our experiences. And it was a fairly small group, and one by one everybody spoke about their psychic stroke spiritual experiences. And one girl said, related her own experience she'd had, but she said, I'll be honest with you, I find it so fantastic, I question it so much, I now don't know if it happened or not. Because, society, modern life, chat, people don't believe you if you have these experiences. It's very difficult, particularly in certain walks of life, where still, unfortunately, people are frightened to say that they have some spiritual interests, even though it has broken down a great deal, even though there is a greater interest. So it is hard. How do we validate it? Do we validate it by other people? Just because 10,000 people have the same experience as us, does it make it right? There were thousands that followed Hitler after all. Does that validate it? And if you're one of a group who feels that your path is slightly different from other people, what courage it takes to say, well, actually, no, that's not for me. You get that quite a lot in spiritual workshops and such. You get someone who's gained a lot from a particular workshop, so very naturally goes out and tells all their friends, you've got to come and have a workshop with this person, they're fantastic. But it may not be right for that person. What's right for one person isn't necessarily right for someone else. But it's having courage to say to your friend, well, I'm glad that helped you, but I really don't feel this is right for me. And then the courage of that friend to respect that and say, well, that's your choice, and not to persuade them. Unfortunately, the New Age movement is full of judgment on other people. I'd like to say it isn't. I've met some very, very judgmental people in the New Age movement who totally believe that they're doing right by being judgmental in this way. So I think what is happening now in the climate, the astrological climate, is giving us the opportunity to look at our fundamental beliefs. I'm not just talking about our spiritual or religious beliefs. I'm talking about the belief that when you wake up in the morning the sun's going to shine. I mean, things that you may not think in terms of beliefs. Perhaps things that you've taken for granted over many years may not be panning out as you imagine that they should be or might be. One of the most common illusions, I think, is that if people follow a spiritual pathway or they do a spiritual practice, they believe that God will look after them, and really what they're saying is God will provide them with the money. And that can be an illusion. So I think, we have this idea that if we do something spiritual, we will somehow be looked after. And in a sense we are, of course, because in a sense we're always safe. But it's the inner connection with spirituality that allows us to know that. It isn't how much money we've got in the bank. Anyway, the unfoldment process of communicating with your core self. Most people that I come in contact with, and I'm sure it's the same with people here, have a sense that they come into this kind of movement because they feel there's something else. They feel there's something more to life, and this is the usual phrase that people fall into. Perhaps they've had a psychic or spiritual experience, and I use those terms as slightly different from each other, because although a spiritual experience might be psychic, a psychic experience need not be spiritual, because there are different levels of psychism. They might be instinctual, they might be on an animal level. There's nothing wrong with that, but it might not particularly be spiritual, or at least what is perceived to be spiritual. So this unfoldment process that I could talk for great lengths at, but I won't, but just to draw your attention to what happens when somebody does consciously acknowledge their spirituality. In a sense, they've started a movement from which they can never turn back, because it is like shining a light in a dark room. Masking the truth becomes more and more difficult as you progress. If you work with it consciously through healing or something else, you're bound to see all sorts of things popping up all over the place. You might have some emotional disturbance, you might have a physical disturbance, you might have an old worn-out pattern that you need to look at that stems from some bad experience in childhood or even a previous life. But these things begin to pop up. And so initially, when you go on this unfoldment process, it's extremely difficult. And I often think that students that do willingly go on this pathway could certainly be forgiven for giving up and running away at the first hurdle, because there is a sense, my God, this is huge. And it is huge, actually, it is. I do feel it's more courageous to look at yourself and to look at who you are than it is to climb Mount Everest or something. I think it takes enormous courage to do that. It takes enormous courage to reveal who you are to other people. Not because you want to be bolshy or you want to be better than them, but because you want to have a truthful relationship with people. And that's enormously difficult. And it takes years. And, I mean, it is lifelong. It doesn't end. Very often people come in to this work and they don't know what some of their potentials are. And so all this revelation reveals things they didn't know. And it's not that it's revealed something that is different. It's revealing something probably that was always there but was masked by all the noise and the difficulties that they've had. So it is a challenge. And yes, there are illusions along the way, and perhaps there has to be. Because if you genuinely wish to be honest, you will see things eventually. And maybe you have been drawn down to the odd cul-de-sac. But that's fine. That's okay. Learn from it, grow, pick it up and walk on. This idea that we're in a world that if you're spiritual, it's all love and peace and harmony. I'm not convinced that this life is about peace and harmony. I'm not convinced it's about not having a struggle. In fact, if you look carefully at some writings, it will mystical writings, it will say the opposite, that actually struggle is part of our world, and it's what we learn because we build spiritual muscle through it. We need something to push against. If there's no struggle, we don't always grow. But I think there's a very great difference between having some kind of scaffolding in our lives that we grow and move from, as opposed to a set model which holds us in. If you have a set belief that is holding you too rigidly, I think there's a danger. If you have some kind of looser scaffolding from which you can say, well, at this point in my life, this is what I understand, this is what I'm going to use, this is what's going to help me, and then perhaps later on there'll be something else, and so it goes on. At its deepest sense, spirituality is intuitive. It's part of your intuition. The thing about intuition, it's not predictable. People often put intuition with some sort of psychic prediction, but actually they're very different. Because intuition will tell you what you need to know now in the moment. But that might be different next week. And so if somebody works intuitively, they're often described as unpredictable, unreliable, because people can't put them in a little box. They don't know what they're going to do next. So they're seen as dizzy or connected or not focused or whatever, so it's very difficult. And the same thing applies in one's own life. If you have an intuitive sense about one thing that is right for you in one day, it might be perfectly right for you one day, but the same thing 5 years on is going to be completely wrong for you. But how do you validate that? How can you live in a world with that? It's quite difficult, I think, for people to come to terms with it. There are certain things, and unfortunately for many people, they need some trauma to push them into that moment that they can move on. Would that we'd be so aware that wouldn't happen to us. But the reality is very often we don't see things. I mean, our whole life is about change, if you think about it. And I often think, well, why are we so frightened of change when every single minute of every single day is about change and movement? Everything is movement. And that's the same with us. It has to be movement. And yet we have this idea that we can somehow find this ideal stationary state. Maybe in our core spirit we can, and maybe that's always there. But in terms of our bodily being in the physical world, I'm not sure it's possible. Because if you have no movement, you have stagnancy, and you have disease, which then creates movement. So, it just doesn't happen. And you can watch it in people's lives. I mean, I'm a great people watcher. I love people. I don't think you can really do the sort of work I do as a healer and a teacher if you didn't like and love people and fascinated by them. But I watch this sort of movement. Some people, when their life is perhaps on a plateau, then all of a sudden something happens out the blue and they're off again. So it's very interesting to observe these ebbs and flows that we all have and we all go through. Again, this idea of spirituality, we expect something good and perfect and light and peaceful. Is being spiritual about being peaceful? I don't know. That's an open question, is it? I have a sense that the greatest challenge at this time, this increasingly changing time, is to bring spirit into matter, to actually live in the moment day by day, and to bring spirituality through into the material world. And I don't think we have to wait to get to heaven to do it. I think if we do, we are what Krishnamurti used to call a living meditation. If we live like that, then we are living in this material world spiritually, as a spiritual being. There's different elements here, aren't there? If you take us all as energetic beings, so each of us have a certain magnetism, let's say, we're going to attract to us what that energy is putting out. So that's karma, in fact, isn't it? What you put out, you get back. And I see that energetically, more than some kind of concept of moral judgment. We're an energy, and what we get out, that dictates what we get back. I can only answer from my own personal thoughts and experience, which may not be the same as you or anybody else in this room. So I'm not saying that this is right or wrong. I'm saying what I've perceived. I have perceived that if people are not in some state of consciousness of their spirituality, they very often drift. And those people, you can actually quite effectively predict their lives if you link in with them energetically, because they're not going to consciously change. They're on certain paths, they're not going to change it, and you can say, Mrs. Smith, Jones, whatever, is going to do ABC, and you can probably pin it right down to the day or even the minute. But the moment that person exercises some consciousness in their pathway, any number of things can happen. So the more conscious a person is, the more they avail themselves to free will, if you like. And that's my observation. Of course, some people don't want free will. Some people will come maybe want to go for a psychic sitting and being told what to do. They don't want it. It threatens them. Free will, because it means they'd have to take responsibility. Free will means you have to take responsibility. And there are many people that don't want to take responsibility, and that's fine, because in a sense that is their free will to exercise. But I think once you start opening up, all things can and do change and expand. And I think, yes, to some extent, I don't think you can predict what's going to happen to the world. There does seem to be an energetic consensus that the whole planet has come to, that they're going on to a more positive, let's say, slant. And of course it's going to take many years, probably hundreds, maybe even thousands, for that to pan out. But I think that there is some kind of willingness, energetic and magnetic and conscious willingness for something for us to break through. And I think my understanding is it happened sometime in the middle of the Second World War, about 1943. This sort of group consciousness, and that we were going to move on. I know Alice Bailey equates that with the breaking of the atom. I don't know. I have no particular knowledge of that. It may be or not, but I do think that something happened at that time that made, on a very deep consciousness level, for for humanity to move forward productively. And it might be that we needed a world war to get us into that state of mental, it focused the minds and hearts of humanity at that time. And God knows, I mean, I'm very anti-war. I'm a tremendous pacifist, but I do think that these things happen sometimes to necessitate movement and change. It doesn't make them right, doesn't make them pleasant, but I think that does happen. And it happens to us personally. Every one of us, look back at times when you've had great pressure and trauma, and what's happened out of it. Huge steps have come, haven't they? But they simply wouldn't have happened. Free will is a biggie, isn't it? We could talk endlessly about that. I don't know. That's my perception, if it's of any help.